Les recuerdo, estamos en el ciclo de conferencias del Centro, Estudios, China-México de la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM. De nuevo, muy agradecidos por su presencia. Antes de presentar al señor embajador, les recuerdo dos o tres temas. Estamos muy contentos, seguimos con el trabajo de los cuadernos de trabajo del Centro de Estudios China-México. Tenemos la última presentación que ya está, sobre el último documento que ya está en internet también, es el documento del embajador Sujan R, que estuvo acá con nosotros hace un mes. Entonces vamos a publicarlo para revisarlo. Y un segundo anuncio, estamos muy contentos de lo que hemos informado recientemente del esfuerzo de este segundo seminario de América Latina y el Caribe. Nos tratamos de hacer un ratito de para difundir el evento. Entonces, incluso los que quisieran llevarse algún póster, sobre todo para ponerlos en alguna vitrina, no para tirarlo a la basura. Entonces, ojalá se pudieran llevar alguno para ponerlo donde trabajo, donde laboren, estaría muy agradecido. Now we will shift to English. As we make the invitation, the presentation today will be English. We are very happy and thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for accepting the invitation to be here at our center. Again, the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies is part of the School of Economics of UNAM, and we are very happy that you are here with us. We've been working for quite some time on this topic, and we are extremely looking forward to your analysis on this very important topic on the relationship between India and China. I would simply like to recall and remind you that Ambassador Sujan Chinoy is the Ambassador of India here in Mexico since 2012, almost 2012. Ambassador Sujan Chinoy is fluently Chinese, and when I invited him, he told me he could make a presentation either in Chinese or in English. I kind of thought it will be the presentation in English. I simply would like to remind you and to recall that he has been in many different official places from the Indian government. Particularly relevant for the topic of today and for the work of our center is that he has been specializing with a personal interest also on issues regarding Asia in general, but particularly China. So Ambassador has been in several Indian missions in Hong Kong and in Beijing. He was the Consul General of India in Shanghai between 2000 and 2005. And he has been publishing also and giving a lot of lectures on this topic. And working also on India's external trade and its economic activity. So again, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for allowing us to have this dialogue. And as I commented to the idea of this kind of presentation of around 30 minutes, 45 minutes, something like that, so that then later in exchange and the dialogue with the people. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Should I use this mic? Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much for those very flattering remarks and introduction, Dr. Enrique Russell Peters, my old friend, for we have been part of a panel at the Mexico Business Summit, and I am very grateful to you for your invitation this morning to speak to you at the Centro de Estudios China-México of the Faculty of Economics of UNAM. I also wish to acknowledge the presence this morning of Ambassador Eugenio Anguano Rock, a very senior Mexican diplomat who has been your ambassador in China and has been stationed in China more than once. So I dare say that I have very little to say or to add on the subject of China in the presence of such a learned audience. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak in English, because as I told you, the only other alternative for me was to speak in Chinese. And that should have been fine, because this is after all the Institute of Chinese Studies in UNAM. But I also wish to say that I am very impressed with your university's motto, which reads Por mi raza hablara el espíritu. It's very important, because this really means the aspiration of students and faculty to achieve cultural, spiritual, racial and territorial unity. As someone who comes from a multicultural background, such as India, it resonates very well with me, and I can identify with this spirit of yours. We have a very ancient saying in Sanskrit, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which really means that the entire world is one family. And that is equally a very important saying by the great sage Confucius, and that is Confucius said, 四海之内皆兄弟也. All the peoples across the four oceans are brothers and sisters. So I think it is in that spirit that we value our own individual culture, our pluralistic society, the whole focus being on unity in diversity today, not only in the context of our own country, but also as global citizens. For we live in a much more globalized world than before. I intend to speak briefly on India-China relations, which is actually a very vast topic. I'm afraid I may not be able to do full justice in the time allocated, which is about 30 to 45 minutes. But I also wish to say a few words at the end, time permitting, on India-Mexico relations, which is equally important for me in my current assignment. Let me begin by saying that India and China, and this is a truism which is known to all of you, are two of the world's oldest civilizations. We have coexisted as ancient neighbors for thousands of years, and we are two of the world's most populous countries. China with its more than 1.3 billion people, and India with its 1.2 billion people. Together we make up 40% of the global population. Now that's a remarkable figure. When you look at 100 people around the world, 40 of them are expected to be either from India or China. And so therefore we think that our destinies are also linked, as we are ancient neighbors, most populous. And today, with the growth engines having shifted to the Asia-Pacific region, both India and China are increasingly the epicenter of the new global economic forces that are emerging, and are also destined to play an important role as a part of the new economic forces that are shaping our world today. As you all know, over the past 3 decades, China has emerged as a very dynamic economic center in Asia, with breathtaking changes that have been set off by its reforms and modernization programs. And despite the after effects of the global economic downturn, most recently in 2013, China still ended the year with about 7.5% of growth rate in its GDP. It really demonstrates the kind of resilience that has been built into the Chinese economy over the past 30 years. They have their stellar achievements of this day. And India, which began its reforms much later in the 1990s, has also emerged as one of the world's fastest growing economies today. India and China, together with a number of other emerging economies around the world, that it's no longer restricted to just India and China. For we have seen in Asia the emergence of Indonesia, of high growth rates posted by countries like Thailand and the Philippines. Further afar in Africa, we have seen South Africa, Nigeria. In Latin America, Mexico is obviously one of the biggest economies, the biggest trading nation, and one on which we put our long-term bets as being a force to reckon with in Latin America in years to come. India and China, as I mentioned before, are continent-sized countries. We are also, in a sense, continent-sized economies. In my view, we have complementarities. It makes us partners, not rivals, as is often made out in the international media. India and China are not rivals. In fact, we are partners in this great economic effervescence and change and flux that is taking place in the Asia-Pacific region. If China commenced its reforms with infrastructure and hardware, equally India focused first on its knowledge-based industries. If China, for instance, has a unitary structure suited to its own needs, India practices multi-party democracy. If China leads in terms of FDI in the manufacturing sector, India has done extraordinarily well for itself with FDI in its mature financial sector. If China relies on an FDI-fueled, exports-driven model for economic growth, India has relied more on its domestic investments and domestic market, making it relatively resistant to the adverse effects of the two global financial and economic crises. So as you can see, we have each chosen our own models and we each have our own achievements. In a very perceptive article written by Wang Yasheng, who you may know, he was the associate professor, and I believe he still maybe at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. He and Tarun Khanna, then professor at the Harvard Business School, they wrote an article in the Foreign Policy Journal number 137 of July-August 2003 that India had managed to spawn a number of companies that now compete internationally with the best that Europe and the United States have to offer. Moreover, many of these firms are in the cutting-edge areas of technology, knowledge-based industries, firms such as our software giants, for instance, Infosys and Wipro. These are well-known pharmaceutical and biotechnology powerhouses like Dr. Reddy's laboratories. All of them have a presence in Mexico as well, but I shall not go into those details. They basically made this point that India had also developed a very strong infrastructure to support private enterprise. Our capital markets operated with great efficiency, they have heard, and despite our flaws, the legal system in India was considerably advanced. Basically, one might say from a macro point of view that the approach to change in China was perhaps top-down, whereas the approach to change in India was perhaps more bottom-up. But this really means that each country chose a system most suitable to its own requirements. Goldman Sachs, as you know, has predicted that India and China respectively could be the dominant global suppliers of services in the case of India and manufactured goods in the case of China by 2050. These two would be among the most dominant economies in these two sectors. In effect, China and India are like the yin and yang of the new economic order. The late senior Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, he had said, with good reason, when he met former Prime Minister, the late Rajiv Gandhi, during Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's path-breaking visit to China in December 1988, of which I was a part, that the 21st century would be the Asian century. He had also added with prophetic vision that it could not be the Asian century without the participation of both China and India. And people like Thomas Friedman, in his book, for instance, The World is Flat, the history of the 21st century, also describes vividly the gradual shift of the global economic center of gravity to the Asia-Pacific region, and the potential role that a country like China and a country like India will play in years to come. Why should Asia be regarded as important, for instance, for anybody? We must note that a full 60% of the global population lives in Asia, and it is this 60% of the global population, not just India and China, but other countries, all add up to 60%. And 60% of the global population has been exposed to 6% growth rates or more steadily for many years. So therefore, Asia and the Asia-Pacific region is really the fastest growing region in the global economy. Latin America is the second fastest growing economy. And there are reasons, therefore, why countries such as India and China must connect more closely in Asia, and countries like Mexico must connect more with countries like China and India. Asia also straddles very important economic trade and cooperative structures like APEC, ASEAN, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And Asia is also witnessing unprecedented flows of capital, technology, and resources. You have your own Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations going on currently, the TPP, and the TPP is likely to ultimately lead to the realization of the dream of more effective trade and economic cooperation across the Pacific Rim. So having said that, let me return back to the topic of India and China. This was the context. Relations between India and China not only date back several millennia, but our ties are bound together by concrete examples of interaction, of give and take. The Buddhism, the religion of Buddhism, for instance, the advent of Buddhism from India to China 2000 years ago, forged bonds of friendship and inspired cultural exchanges between China and India. Historically speaking, China may well be considered a country that has influenced the cultures of its neighbors, historically. But India, however, is an early and contrarian example. The impact of Indian culture, such as Buddhism from India, is acknowledged in China as a cultural impact that came from India to China. Indian thought, Indian philosophy did have an impact on ancient Chinese culture. Of course, it was a process of give and take, and we also received many good things from Chinese culture. But there is no gainsaying the fact that Buddhism and Indian thought and philosophy taken across not only by ancient Indian philosophers, but also ancient Chinese philosophers who came to India in search of ancient Buddhist texts, such as Xuanzang, Faxian. All these people came and sought texts and scriptures and took them back to China. Those familiar with Chinese culture would know that Bodhidharma, the Buddhist monk from southern India, who visited China in the 5th century AD. In China he is called Tamo, and he is revered as the patron saint of the Shaolin monastery in central China. He is also the founder of Zen Buddhism worldwide. Zen, of course, is a Japanese word. In China, in Chinese you would call it Chan, and in Hindi, Sanskrit, the Sanskrit origin of the term is Dhyan. So you can see the kind of cultural impact that was felt in centuries past. Xuanzang, as you all know, the famous Han Dynasty Chinese monk came to travel to India from 631 to 643. He was in India for like 12 years, collecting Buddhist scriptures, and his historical odyssey is immortalized by the Ming Dynasty writer Wu Chang'an in the epic novel Xi You Qi, Journey to the West. If you haven't read this in Spanish, and if it's available in Spanish, you must read it. It is a fascinating book of its time, written about 500 years ago by Wu Chang'an, and it really puts into perspective the kind of cultural contacts that existed historically between China and India. In times past, India and China accounted 300 years ago, for instance, in the Ming Dynasty, for 40% of the global economy. Until the 17th century, it is on record that these two countries together accounted for 40% of the global economy, and this is of course before the depredations of colonialism extracted their toll on the two countries. So from a historical standpoint, the peoples of India and China have always sympathized with one another. We had our cultural contracts, but of course these were episodic when you look at 2000 years. It is the 20th century and the imploding age of a globalized world with its telecommunication revolution, information technology revolution, air travel, etc., which actually shrunk our space and made the barrier historically posed by the Himalayas no longer a barrier. And we immediately came into a new kind of contact with each other, a realization that both were emerging countries. India was emerging into its own with independence in 1947. China was emerging into its own with the revolution and emerged as the People's Republic of China in 1949, and that put both countries into a modern, contemporary and new context. And as co-founders, for instance, of Panchsheel, or the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, we, that is India and China, together gave the world abiding principles for the conduct of international relations and diplomacy, which are relevant even today. During the struggle that the Communist Party of China had for its own freedom and independence, the Indian National Congress had sent a medical mission to China in 1938 to support the Chinese Communist Party. So this level of empathy, of coexistence, of mutual respect, of cooperation has always marked India-China relations. These principles continue to guide the framework of India-China relations even today. I have said something already about China having emerged as one of the fastest growing economies, and India thereafter with its own reforms also having achieved its own in the economic sphere. Both these countries are remarkable in that both China and India have together uplifted a very large number of the poor in their respective countries above the poverty line because of the profound economic changes that are taking place in these two countries. After China, India is perhaps the only other country with those large numbers of having used economic development to bring people out of poverty. We attach the highest of relations, the highest priority to our relations with China, and to further developing friendly and cooperative relations with the People's